All right, welcome back to MBA Success, the podcast where we explore everything MBA. I'm your host, Ross Barclay, and I'm excited today to introduce to you Judy Lundy, the MBA Program Director at Edith Cowan University. With an extensive background in leadership and management education, Judy is passionate about nurturing future leaders and creating inclusive, sustainable workplaces. A proud alumna of the University of New England, she has been instrumental in shaping the MBA experience to meet the evolving demands of the global business environment. Judy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ross. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Now, I'm just curious in general about, your journey and sort of how you've, gone through your career. So I'm interested in sort of where you started, whether you went straight to uni, how you evolved to get to a program director. So,
Sure.
add a little bit of flavour there.
Ross, it's probably not a typical career path. In fact, is there actually any such thing as a typical career path? And it's certainly not a linear career path, but I know that today linear career paths don't particularly exist. So I've been in the workforce for over 40 years. So this could be a long story and I'll try and keep it as short as possible. But essentially, I've had three main careers which I've been in and out of. And I didn't start at uni. In fact, I did get a place in a science degree because I was always going to study animals, wasn't going to work with people. Got a place in a science degree at the Australian National University. But not long after starting that, I actually got an amazing opportunity to be a trainee manager with what was at the time, and remember, I've been in the workforce for over 40 years, so this is quite a long time ago. I got the opportunity to be a trainee manager with what was was Australia's biggest hotel chain. And I spent 10 fabulous years with that hotel chain. Its culture was in my bloodstream, and I was a very, very passionate and committed hospitality manager, and that was without any formal tertiary education. And I was incredibly lucky because that hotel chain had a very, very strong commitment to its people philosophy was growing our own. So they were very committed to developing people. And I went through all sorts of amazing leadership and management development programs while I was there. And my final stint with them was as the HR manager for the opening of a hotel and convention centre. And in that role, I was starting to do a lot of the leadership management and development that had been, I guess, done to me. And even though at that point I didn't actually have any formal background in it. Now, as I said, it's not a non-linear career, and I sort of jumped backwards and forwards between that hospitality management, and I came back to that some years later with another organisation as a general manager. But I also, in between, I started doing more general education and training. So I worked in the TAFE sector for a number of years, developing hospitality managers. And I also worked in the tertiary education sector and in the consulting field. So I just sort of kept on jumping backwards and forwards between particularly management consulting and management education. And I've been lucky enough to do that in 3 different countries. So I had a year in a hospitality management school in Canada, and I had 4 years doing something similar in the Netherlands, and in between doing consulting work generally around people and change, and a lot of that was around leadership development.
Very cool.
Would you like me to throw in there when I actually did the formal education, or would you like that to tease that out a bit later?
Well, I'm curious there. So you've obviously gotten the chance to go overseas and work overseas, and that's obviously a whole different experience on its own, especially some 4 years like in the Netherlands, which I assume operates extremely differently to how we do. I guess you shifted careers. So you said, like, you obviously decided I'm going to go and do some study. And how did that fit in? And again, what motivated you to want to do that, given that you were sort of in this space where you were already facilitating a lot of this learning and development yourself?
Sure. I guess I got my undergraduate degree, which was an adult education degree, when I was working in the TAFE sector. And I'd already realised by then, so not only did they expect me to be formally qualified to be able to sort of teach and train others, but I was also realising that I'd been pretty lucky up until then, and that the world and Australia was changing, that formal qualifications were being more highly valued. And I didn't take too long after I got that adult education degree before I thought, well, we look like we're following particularly North American trends, and postgraduate qualifications are going to become more and more important in this country. So I did my MBA through University of New England, and it certainly was quite a game changer for me, because I would not have got my first international work experience without that. I, in fact, literally, as soon as I had my MBA, I looked at my CV and I said, where's the next gap to fill? And I went, I don't have any international work experience. And the stars aligned, and this opportunity came up in Canada. And I went and had the most amazing year in Canada, teaching at a hospitality business school at a university in Canada. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I'd really like to do something like this again. So when I returned to Australia after that experience, and my MBA was really valuable when I returned to Australia too, because I was doing consulting work, and it always looked good on my signature block that I had MBA. And I don't believe that it on itself, I think you obviously need to be able to prove yourself as well to get credibility, but that combination of being able to prove yourself and having MBA helped. But I really wanted to do at least one more overseas experience, and I thought, well, I'm going to be incredibly lucky to get that again with an MBA. So I spent 7 years doing my DBA, my Doctor of Business Administration, at the University of Newcastle, to give me an opportunity to be able to go more broadly anywhere in the world and teach at any business school anywhere in the world. And that was what got me my position in the Netherlands, and I had 4 fabulous years in the Netherlands.
Oh, wow.
So I was a complete convert in terms of the value of that combination of real world experience with good, rigorous postgraduate qualifications, such as you get through an MBA and a DBA.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'd made that distinction that, hey, I can see a need for this postgraduate certification, and that'll help me in a number of things. Was there anything you were kind of expecting to get out of it, just from that knowledge perspective? You know, how well versed were you with the MBA degree, and just at that point, did you get a lot more out of it than you were expecting when you first did that?
Look, I certainly got a lot out of it. Because I had been lucky enough, both in the sort of training I'd had within industry, and even in my undergraduate degree, where I made sure I'd done a number of, even though it was an adult education degree, I did a lot of management and leadership type units as electives there. So I'd started formally studying it. But of course, once you get up to an MBA, you're doing it at a higher level, and it's really making you think more critically around those experiences that you've had and what you've done well or poorly in the past. So you develop very good, I guess, those that reflective practitioner capability by thinking about what you could have done differently in a former situation, now that you've got this body of knowledge that you didn't have at that time. Yeah. So it probably, it was very, in some ways cathartic, in some ways confronting, thinking back to things that I had, like I was very young as a manager. I was 24 years old and second in charge of a hotel with 70 employees, many of whom were old enough to be my parents. And so there were all sorts of interesting dynamics, particularly, as I said, 24-year-old young blonde female managing men who were old enough to be my father, and thinking about, well, how do I do that? And I think, despite not having had that formal management education, I think I did reasonably well. Had I had the knowledge and insights that I gained through my MBA, I would have done a lot of things quite differently.
Yeah. Talk me through that then, because by the sounds of it, this company, you said, had quite a focus on developing managers and those sorts of things. So given you were so young, managing, being second in charge of a big, a hotel like that, What was the experience of at that time, the training that you'd been given? How did that factor into actually being the second in charge in that? So yeah, I'm interested because, like you said, that's young. That's a lot of
Yeah.
responsibility at that age.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk me through that because it sounds quite progressive from that company.
They were, and their head of HR had come out of he'd been head of a program in the TAFE system where he'd been doing a lot of obviously not at the same sort of level as MBA, but he'd been running a lot of management development programs within the TAFE sector. So he brought in, he probably formalised it much more than would have happened in most of the other hotel chains in those days. So we really did get, even though they were very practically focused programs for frontline supervisors, and then as you progress beyond that, he incorporated a lot of, I guess, the theories and models that you would encounter in a formal education. So very early on, I really got understood what it was to be a Theory X or a Theory Y manager, and I knew that I was a Theory Y manager. I knew that I was, that I had faith in human beings, and I wanted to help them shine and be their best selves. Regardless of whether they were older than me, which pretty much everybody was, or they were my peers, and that really helped because I think, when you're being promoted quite rapidly, and I think one of the biggest challenges you can have is with the peers, because all of a sudden, 1 minute you're at the pub with them and you're just being a mate and doing fun stuff as young people working in hospitality do. And the next minute you're their manager. And the very last thing I wanted to do was to make all of those horrendous mistakes that you see so many people do make, where they just resort to the one and only approach they know, and that's becoming a total autocrat.
Yep.
And that doesn't get the best out of people. So I guess, because I was receptive to those things, and I think I'd always innately had a sense of the importance of fairness, equity, and things like that. When I talk about my diversity and inclusion work, which is my main research area now, I always cite that my very first reflection of when that became important to me was a poem I wrote as a 13-year-old, which was very much around fairness and equity amongst people. So I think I'd always felt this stuff was important. So when I was exposed to these sort of theories and models, that helped me explain how, as a manager, this could be useful to treat people with respect, to help them to be their best selves. I just grabbed that stuff. And so that helped me, I guess, get promoted quite quickly. And then that made me an even more of a sponge when I did that formal management education, because I really had, I had such rich experiences to link my formal MBA studies to.
Yeah, which is definitely a big part of, why it's important to have that experience leading into those programs. So this... doing some maths, are we talking about in the 90s when you were going through this business?
No, it's actually even earlier than that. So
Okay.
it would have been, so I started with that hotel chain as a trainee manager in 1981. So I'm really aging myself there.
No.
And
I asked that because, like I said, that sounds super progressive for even now to a degree, because I'm still blown away with, how many stories you hear of them still hiring or promoting the wrong people. So when you look back at that, would you have said that, you were being promoted on the basis that you showed those leadership qualities, as opposed to, I was just good at this job and, the next rung up the ladder is to become a leader, and therefore,
Yeah, look, there was probably a bit of both. I definitely worked really hard to prove myself from that technical capability point of view in terms of working in each of the departments. But the fact that they recruited me in as a trainee manager, they saw something in me. I won't say it was necessarily the most sophisticated recruitment process, but they recruited me in because they saw something in me in terms of my ability to lead and manage people. And then they invested in that. So they were absolutely very progressive in that regard. And you're absolutely right. It's just quite tragic because I remember in those days there was a big report, and I can't even remember what the title of the report, but it was very much looking at some of the problems in management across Australia, not just in hospitality, but across sectors. And this really gaping gap and problem where we were promoting people who didn't have the capabilities to lead and manage people. Yeah. This was very, very much the focus of some of the programs when I was working in the TAFE sector. Some of the programs I was working on there were responding to that report, looking at how we could build leadership and management capability. And it saddens me to see how little progress we've actually made in that regard. I as a consultant, you're just in an incredibly privileged position because you're going in and out of all different organisations, and you get to see good and bad leaders and managers, good and bad cultures. And you do. It's quite heartbreaking how many still very toxic cultures there are, and we see that in things like the increased rate of claims for psychological distress in workplaces. And thankfully, now that we've got psychosocial risks in health and safety legislation, maybe that will be more attention will be paid to the type of leadership we need to actually help people thrive and to not create these very toxic environments where there's very high levels of psychosocial risks.
Yeah. And I haven't looked into the numbers or anything. You might know. Are the numbers around those getting worse in terms of people's experience holistically with work and sort of that whole dissatisfaction, the disengagement, burnout, those sorts of things? Like, because, the fact that companies are doing this right back in the 80s, yet here we are now in almost the mid 2020s, and we've still got this huge problem. It begs belief to a degree because the amount of productivity lost and the amount of, inefficiencies that cost companies, especially big ones, millions, if not more, in unnecessary expenses, it just seems bewildering.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I don't know that we can get any clear answer from the data anyway, because obviously now that we're talking more about things like psychosocial risks, that's going to increase the amount of reporting. So is it that things are actually getting worse, or is it just that we're reporting more? And I don't think we have a clear answer to that. Yeah. It's still worryingly high. And if you look at things like data from organisations like Comcare or the different state and territory bodies that look at the sort of rates of injury claims, you'll see that there's the data around things like psychological claims is continuing to get worse, and of course that's incredibly worrying and incredibly expensive for workplaces because it's much easier to fix up a physical illness than it is to fix up if somebody has really experienced some significant mental distress because of being what essentially should be avoidable if we lead and manage and design work, and probably not in that order, design and then lead and manage work in a way that actually helps people to thrive, and while at the same time achieving organisational outcomes. And that's, too often we've just focused from that sort of more productivity point of view, just getting those organisational outcomes without realising that that there's a lot of other personal consequences in terms of, and Australia is quite bad. And again, when I think back to my time in the Netherlands, things like, and I'm not sure exactly if the data is the same. So I worked in the Netherlands 2012 to 2016. At that time, the OECD data showed that the Netherlands had some of the lowest working hours, but was one of the most productive countries in the OECD. At that same time, Australia's results were pretty much the reverse of that, some of the longest working hours and some of the poorest productivity. And I think we've still got this very unhealthy notion of face time and long hours, and that doesn't equate to productivity. No. And it certainly doesn't equate to people thriving.
No. And can you, or do you have a sense of what this still, what it comes down to? Is it just the leadership that we have, across the majority of the country and running the businesses is still a little bit behind the times, in the sense that they just haven't skilled up to the level of management that they need in order to understand the gravity of the problem? Because I can't imagine they're not sitting around their boardrooms going, oh, these aren't some very good numbers. One, who knows even if they're listening to the numbers or looking at them. I know a number of the businesses that I've worked in, it's always very challenging to get employee engagement surveys going, get the data in the right way, and then feed it up through to the execs in a meaningful way. It's not exactly an easy process just to get that to start with. But yeah, do you have a sense of what it is that's keeping us stagnant from making the progress that we need to?
I do think that collectively business schools have some responsibility for that. And hey, I'm at a business school, so I don't want to be shooting the business schools, but I think we have largely, not totally, perpetuated an outdated model of more, command and control type management, and have focused excessively on, I guess, one indicator of success, things like shareholder return. Yep. And I'm really, really optimistic because I do see that changing. I see that collectively business schools are getting better at educating around more progressive and relational and inclusive types of leadership. But I also see that we're really taking seriously that we need to be producing managers and leaders that are about value creation for all stakeholders, not just for shareholders. And of course, shareholders are important. Of course, for-profit businesses have to make a profit without question. But there are many, many other really important stakeholders that, whether you're in the for-profit, the not-for-profit, the government, whatever sector you're in, we need to think of our employees as stakeholders. We need to think of the communities that we operate in as stakeholders. We need to think of the planet as a stakeholder, and of course our shareholders as well. Yeah. And I think that is shifting. How long it'll be before we see enough of those graduates with that new mindset out there to really make a shift in our organisations, I don't know. But communities are demanding it, and certainly, if you look at the big challenges that we face, around things like the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, the just transition and things like that, we need to be developing leaders and managers who think differently about creating value.
Yeah. And do you think the business schools, because anyone who's listened to a few episodes of this podcast would know the type of people that have gone through an MBA and the skill set that they've got out of it, and the amazing things that they go on to do whilst keeping in mind all those stakeholders that you've just mentioned. But is it sinking deep enough into the undergrad side of the business schools, and is it because clearly not everybody in the world is going to do an MBA and get that skill set right. So it's how else do we disseminate that knowledge through the system, and get it into people's heads earlier? Like, are you seeing that? Is that something that you're even exposed to?
Look, with this one, I can really only speak with conviction from my own business school's point of view, Edith Cowan University. But I do believe that what I'm going to say here would be evident in other business schools too. So I know particularly business schools that want to be recognised as leading international business schools and go down the pathway of international accreditations, such as the AACSB accreditation and the EQUIS accreditation, have to do that.
Okay.
They have to embed this social and environmental sustainability throughout their curriculum, their research, and their operations. And so it is, and that's certainly our business school is on that pathway. Last year we got our first international accreditation with the AACSB accreditation, and we're currently on the journey to get the EQUIS accreditation. We are like a number of other business schools in Australia, we're a signatory to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Management Education, PRME, and that does not distinguish between undergraduate and postgraduate education. So that means that as a UN PRME signatory, we have to, again, embed sustainability, and I'm using that term broadly to be social and environmental sustainability, throughout everything we do.
Yeah.
And so and I do know, just speaking to some of our, whilst my students are all postgrads because I'm responsible for our full suite of MBA courses, but just going to different student events and talking to some of our undergrad students, I know a lot of them have very much benefited from some of our sustainability education in their curriculum.
Oh, well, absolutely fascinating. Because I hadn't thought about that whole standards and accreditation side of things. So I think that's a really helpful way to frame that up. Going back again a little bit, you made the mention of, how we move the needle to getting people to where we go. And I thought it was really interesting, that cultural element of us as a collective society actually just demanding more of businesses to do better from that perspective. The likes of Qantas, their whole $1 billion profits after all the turmoil that they've been through and how bad that makes them look. The banks consistently posting $6 to $8 billion profits. There's a lot of people in this country struggling a lot. Yet.
And we're seeing that in shareholder activism too. We're seeing shareholders demanding it, which is fantastic, because if shareholders are actually demanding companies do better by those other stakeholders, the C-suite better be listening to that, because then they're not even looking after their primary stakeholder that they were always focusing on. And it's showing that even shareholders are not just all about the financial return. They actually care that what they're investing in is doing right by other stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, I guess now thinking about it, I think at the most fundamental level, that's where it really has to happen, because at the end of the day, if a public company is still, driven by its shareholders to maximize their personal interest of, how much money that they're getting from it, then it's not going to signal anything other. It's like a KPI in a business, right? Like if you're working and this is your KPI and it's just a number that's not necessarily helpful, and somebody else comes along and says, oh, can you move in this direction? Like, no, I'm going for that KPI because that's what I'm getting rated on, right? And it's kind of similar in a profit business. It's like, well, my KPI is set by the shareholders and that's the return that they want to get from me. So if they can start demanding more social and moral, responsibility from that C-suite, then and the board, I think that's, it kind of has to be where it starts.
It absolutely has to be. And that's why, whilst I passionately believe that, I will not lead an MBA program that doesn't recognise this need for broader stakeholder value creation. But I'm also really pleased to see my colleagues who have responsibility for some of our discipline-specific postgraduate qualifications, things like the Masters of Banking and Finance, and that they themselves are really embedding the sustainability message right throughout their curricula, because they also know that those more specialised managers that we graduate from a business school need to get this. It can't just be your MBA, who we know that your MBA grads have to have that good broad understanding of business, but we want our specialised managers to also be committed to that journey too.
Yeah.
So it's great. As I said, I love to see that, and so we have. I'm on our school's Responsible Management and Sustainability Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great to hear on that committee what's happening across all the different disciplines to make sure that both our postgraduate and undergraduate curriculum and all the other things that we're doing, research and operations, embed this theme of social and environmental sustainability.
Yeah. And I can imagine being based in Perth and the nature of the business environment in Perth being heavily mining and those sorts of things, you'd have an interesting perspective on, I can imagine a number of executive leaders come through your program that work for mining companies, which again have historically been on that less, socially moral stance. And I can imagine a lot of that's quite changing, especially some of the bigger ones. I know that they have huge programs that are trying to help give back to the community. I guess, how do you see, is that something that you've seen evolve as more people have gone through it? Or, this is an interesting to get your take on that.
I do believe that they are all taking that seriously, and you can. I'm going to use an interesting analogy to try and highlight this. When I was working in the Netherlands, I was lucky enough to go to a conference in Berlin. So it was an HR conference, but it was looking at things like creating good employee value propositions. And the most impactful presentation came from somebody who was the head of HR in one of the major tobacco companies. And I was going, wow, I didn't see that coming. And he was really selling that because it was an unpopular sector that faced criticism, if they did not get their employee value proposition absolutely right, they were really going to struggle to attract talent.
Yep.
And I think I'm seeing some of that same in the energy and natural resources sector here. I did, prior to being in my current role as MBA Director here, I did a small piece of research we were looking at doing some innovation to our Masters of HR, and I did a small piece of research going out and talking to people in two main sectors, the two main employing sectors in WA, energy and natural resources and government. And it was really clear, the interviews I did in the energy and natural resources sector, that they were seeing themselves a bit like that tobacco company did in Europe. They recognised that they had some image problems and they needed to really be able to attract the best and the brightest. They needed to show that they were doing some really good stuff, both in the social and environmental sustainability place, and incorporate that in their employee value proposition so that they were able to attract the best and brightest talent. So I do think that's certainly, and I've only been in WA for 5 years, so I really can't comment historically about how long that's been emerging, but it's certainly something I've seen in my time here, that it is something that is taken very, very seriously in that sector.
Excellent. And so going to the ECU program that you run, I guess since you've been there, what have you been trying to, you've sort of touched on bits and pieces, we're doing this, we're doing that. What is it, I guess, that you guys, what you're looking to do, or, just tell us a bit more about your program, I guess, to
Sure.
begin with. And because I'm curious as to sort of see how it differentiates from my experience going through QUT and, friends of mine that have done UQ and those sorts of things.
Okay. So I've got two main programs, and that's like all universities in Australia, we have to review, the regulator requires us to review our courses continuously, and I'm right in the middle of a major course review at the moment. So, and moving forward, we'll continue to have those two main programs. I can't predict entirely the outcome of that major course review because I haven't done all of the data research and haven't spoken to all the stakeholders I need to speak to. But in a nutshell, our main MBA program is designed around a theme of human-focused business transformation. And that does include the social and environmental sustainability part, but recognising that that the world is changing at a phenomenal pace, and we need to be graduating leaders who feel comfortable to take their organisations on a transformation journey and take their people on a transformation journey, whether that transformation journey is around addressing the climate crisis or addressing challenges that AI is presenting, or whatever that transformation journey is, that they're doing it in a way that that brings their people along the journey. So that's my I guess flagship main MBA program. And as like with I think many other universities, we have another MBA program, which we currently call our MBA International, probably not the most descriptive name, but it's one that doesn't require the same levels of experience, whereas our regular MBA program, of course, is aimed at as experienced managers. Yep. Our MBA International doesn't require the same level of experience, but it very much is around international business, and it's looking at a lot more around some of those things, like, you know, different geopolitical risks and all sorts of things about doing business internationally. So that's my two suites of programs. Both of them need to have that sustainability focus in them, though, because we know that that's not going away. And as I said, indeed, both postgraduate and undergraduate business education needs to recognise that and needs to move forward in that way.
Yeah, and I know a month ago or whatever, when we were organising this chat, we had the conversation on the phone. I mentioned that I've started studying my business psychology, Masters of Business Psychology degree, for purely that reason, that the way the world is changing, I think is just going to create such a flux that knowing how, you know, the people side and the psychological side and that mental, you know, side of things, I think is really important right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having that skill set to help, you know, navigate the complexity that situation is going to throw up is really helpful. Like AI, this ChatGPT side of things, I think, you know, the disruption that will cause in 3 to 5 years, I don't think anyone can actually predict it yet.
Absolutely. But the important thing is that we don't try and put our head in the sand and say it's not happening. You know, like, you know, any business school or organisation that does that is going to maybe cease to exist is a bit too dramatic, but they're certainly not going to be they're not going to be able to effectively respond. We just have to look at, well, what are the opportunities that this presents us? But as you said, there's that personal impact on people. And I think all too often, and again, look, I'm going to sound as if I'm really critical of this country, but, you know, my 4 years in, and things are not perfect in the Netherlands either, but the Netherlands is a very interesting country because it's such a small country. Picture this, 2/3 the size of Tasmania with 18 million people. Now, that requires really good collaboration to make things work. It requires really good coordination and forward planning to make things work. Because if you don't have those things, when you've got that sort of dynamic, it falls in a big hole. We've sort of had this luxury in this country of sort of thinking, oh, well, it doesn't matter. You know, we got lots of space and we got, you know. So we're not great at forward planning. And I know that with the rate of change, we can't predict everything. So we've always got to build flexibility into any of our planning. We can't just sort of say, this is the way we're going. But we do need to be looking from that complexity point of view at all of the different interconnections and try to coordinate as best we can. Because too often that sort of, I know the answer, is a fatal flaw because there is generally no one answer. We have to think about impacts of all of our decisions on all those different stakeholders. We have to think about the longer term impacts, the more immediate impacts. And so we probably always needed to develop leaders with those sort of good critical thinking skills, but even more important now, given that the complexity has just ramped up so much, and then you think that you bring the human side into that, and that whole psychology. I was reading an article in The Conversation this morning, and it was about teenagers and the high levels of mental distress in teenagers that the climate crisis was posing. And it just made me think, well, there's so many of us feeling so anxious about so many things. Of course, we've, survived the tidal wave of COVID, and then we've got the climate crisis, and we've got all the global tensions around what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in the Ukraine. And we're human. We feel these things. We take these things on board. And that old notion, which thankfully has largely died out in our workplaces, of, you leave your personal self at the door when you come into the organisation, it's just not possible. And we just need to make sure that we've got leaders well equipped to support that. And that's why that sort of very human-focused approach is important.
Yeah. Interesting that I watched a video this morning. There's a guy, Dr. John Campbell. I think he's an Australian guy who lives in the UK, and he's got a YouTube channel that just looks at all the health news and the statistics, and kind of just gives people the data as it comes out from the different things. And he was talking about excess deaths at the moment. And in 2023, I think in the US, they're still sitting at about 20%. Over excess deaths. The UK is about 15%. Australia, I think for the most of the year, has been above 10%, and it's now dropped down to about 6%. But it's all like cardiovascular. It's like the respiratory deaths are lower than what they are expected to be at this point in time. So he's kind of just sort of making this point that this is real strange, and no one's talking about it. Like, there's all these people like the liver, people dying of liver problems, heart disease, and these other things that, and all age ranges, 20 to 75 are all sort of experiencing this. And you're going, so not only, it just highlights the complexity of this whole situation that, we thought COVID was the one thing that was sort of creating this really bad health problem, but we're experiencing that clearly in all these other places that aren't getting the attention that they probably deserve by the sounds of what he was talking about in those numbers.
And I'm going to bring that back to the value of an MBA, because, and I know it's great to have things like Masters of HR where you produce dedicated HR professionals. It's great to have things like Masters of Finance where you produce dedicated finance people. But one of the beauties of an MBA is that it helps you develop that more multidisciplinary thinking. Now, ideally, that will be not just the business disciplines, because you'll be getting insights from science, for example, when you're looking at things like sustainability. So I know in our responsible management unit, we embed a lot of climate science in that, for example. But at the very least, you're going to be getting that looking across and thinking about how does a business as an organisation, how do all the connections within and hopefully without externally, because if you really look at an organisation as a complex open system, you have to be looking beyond the organisational boundaries. In fact, do the organisational boundaries actually even exist anymore, particularly when you look at different forms of how we bring in talent and how we engage with different stakeholders. And so we need to be, that is one of the values of an MBA. I think it does naturally, by its nature, because you have to look in that cross business disciplines, it naturally helps you think more systemically.
Yeah. And going back, I guess, to your MBA program, and it's designed to help people, guide them through that transformation, do you have a view, or, what are the key problems that you see people having to navigate in the near future? Are there certain things that, again, like AI, the governance issues and all that sort of stuff? Do you have an idea of what those big high level ticket things are people should be looking out for?
Clearly AI has to be one of them, because if we look at what's happened over the last 12 months, it's just phenomenal, and goodness knows where we're going to go over the next 12 months. So that's there's no doubt that that's one of them. I do think, and you raised the governance issue, given that we have so much concern around things like the climate crisis, like biodiversity loss, the just transition and things like that. And we do have things like corporate regulators really starting to ramp up their activity, and they need to, because I think too often we've had too much greenwashing or pinkwashing or whatever sort of washing that you want to call it. We need organisations to genuinely be making changes, sustainable changes, and accurately reporting on those if, as a society, we are going to address the big problems we face. And so I guess there is that taking that reporting really, really seriously and taking that action and that the impact of the action. And that's another thing that's I'm really delighted in our business school, and I believe I'm seeing that more broadly in Australian business schools, really taking that impact measurement much, much more seriously. And so that's something I'd like to see continue. There's no doubt, I think, that there is still some backlash that we have to deal with. I find it unfathomable, although I don't want to come across that I'm judging people, but I find it unfathomable that some people don't get that there is a climate crisis. I find it unfathomable that some people still, by trying to create fairer, more equitable workplaces, that we're being woke. And I do think that we need to be producing leaders who can actually stand firm and connect with people both, so from a head and a heart point of view, to show them that these things are important and present the logic as to why they're important, and also the emotion to get people on board, because I think we're going to see some more of that backlash, and leaders need to be able to be strong and withstand that.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, and there's a good amount to think about. So I think that's it's a fairly good place, I think, to start taping this conversation down. One of the questions, that we always ask people who come on the podcast is about success and what success means to you, what success looks like to you. So I'm interested, Judy, like what is success for yourself?
I do take quite a holistic view of success, and that could be something to do with the stage of my career that I'm at. And you've probably picked up in the conversation that there's a lot of things that I'm really passionate about, and I'm determined to be part of that change, trying to change workplace cultures. And I think I look at success both on a macro and a micro level. I get enormous personal graduates, individual graduates really thriving and hearing their stories. And to me, that's success. But on that more macro level, it's going to be seeing some real and genuine shifts. Now, I have to be careful not to set myself up for a sense of failure there, because this is something I have been dreaming about for a very, very long time. I think since I read Ricardo Semler's Maverick. That was the other thing I used a lot in the early days, was some, inspiration from great business books. And I think I read Ricardo Semler's Maverick at some stage in the late 80s or early 90s. And that helped me think that there were different ways that we could design and lead our workplaces. And yet, as we've discussed, the rate of change has been glacially slow. So I guess helping to shift that narrative will be a measure of success that I'm hoping that I get to see in my career.
Yeah, excellent. No, I think it's not too many more important things I think we can do right now and help the businesses and the individuals build the systems that we need for longevity. As you've mentioned multiple times, that sustainability thing in multi facets is really important. Well, thank you. I guess, is there anything else you wanted to, share with us, and the listeners? Any last sort of words of wisdom you'd like to impart on us?
The only thing I will say, just to wrap up, and it's just been delightful chatting with you about all of this. I think you can tell that I'm pretty passionate about it. It can be very easy to give up hope. And I think it's important so that to be for individual leaders to be able to go the hard yards and do the journey. Of course, there's a self-care piece as well, because you've got to sometimes some of the things where you're trying to fight battles and it can just feel so exhausting, and so you've got to know what you need to be well to thrive, so that you can actually support others on that journey. But never to give up on hope, even with all the bad press around. Personally, if I gave up hope, I just wouldn't get out of bed anymore. And so do what you need to do to remain hopeful. Stay curious and keep asking great questions to try and understand what's happening around you, so that you can be part of the journey and part of the solution.
Excellent. I think that's great. Awesome. Well, Judy, I don't even think we really moved off the first topic that we were going to talk about today. Clearly, we could talk for a lot longer about all this sort of stuff. You're excited about it. I'm excited about it. So maybe we'll hopefully, do another one of these sometime in the future. But good luck with your reviews, all the accreditations for ECU, and all the work that you're doing to help grow that next generation of leaders.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ross. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, I'll keep you on just for a second. Stop that recording.